2 carry-on bags, 1 promise, and a map softened by years. This vacation would heal, not hurry. 2 husbands steal a week by the water, chasing laughter, keeping courage, remembering vows. If your heart's been tired, walk beside them. Salt air, slow mornings, and love that keeps showing up for you. Subscribe, share, and stay a while. This gentle love story keeps you company. Leave a comment. Tell us who you're traveling with. If you're watching with your favorite mug in hand, welcome. Settle in. This story walks at your speed, steady, kind, and hopeful. It begins in a kitchen just after sunrise, with toast popping, a pen tapping an old notepad, and 2 men who have learned that tenderness is a choice you keep making. Daniel is 61, pragmatic in the best way. Reading glasses on a cord, pills sorted for the week, a neat stack of travel confirmations clipped with a bulldog clip. He used to be a school counselor, and it lingers. You can hear it in the way he says, "Take your time," and means it. Marco is 59, a physical therapist who never forgets a name. He talks to neighbors like he's been waiting to hear how their day is going. He laughs with his whole chest, and when he cries, he doesn't apologize. Together, they're 33 years of history, 8 years married, and still practicing the art of showing up. They've had a season like many couples do, where the calendar felt like a list of appointments instead of possibilities. A scare last winter rearranged their priorities. More vegetables, fewer what-ifs, earlier bedtimes, sunlight on the face whenever possible. The numbers leveled. The scans came back clearer. They didn't say, "We deserve a vacation." They said, "Let's notice our life." And then Marco saw a photo of a lighthouse caught in a golden hour so generous it looked like the shore was blushing. And he said, "Maine." Daniel looked up from the notepad where he'd written, "Make copies of prescriptions," and rubbed his thumb over the paper like it was a lamp with a wish inside. "Maine," he said, as if the word itself held a breeze. They picked the coast, Portland to Camden to Bar Harbor. Nothing rushed. Plenty of places to sit. A promise to listen to the ocean until the ocean listened back. Daniel booked inns with first-floor rooms and railings where railings mattered. Marco highlighted bakeries on the map and wrote popovers in the margin like a prayer. They would walk when walking felt good. They would nap when napping felt better. They would look at the horizon and let it widen the part of them that had tightened around old fears. Departure morning, the house held that particular hush of beginnings. The neighbor's cat, who had appointed them her second family, did a final inspection of their suitcases and declared them acceptable with a tail flick. Daniel double-checked the stove, then smiled as he watched Marco also double-check the stove. "Married life," Daniel said. "Backup for the backup." Marco grinned, pressing a kiss to Daniel's temple. At the airport, they moved in a well-practiced duet. Shoes off, belts in the tray, Daniel's little bag of medications placed gently for inspection. TSA smiled, said good morning, and waved them through with a kindness that still surprises you when it happens in public spaces. They shared a banana at the gate, sat side by side in the kind of silence that feels like a blanket around the shoulders, and watched a toddler march like a tiny mare down the aisle of seats. The toddler turned and waved solemnly. Marco waved back with the same solemnity. Daniel said, "Campaign promise, more snacks." On the plane, clouds layered like meringue. Daniel pressed his ring finger against the window and watched their reflection. 2 men who'd learned to hold hands without looking down to see if it was okay. Marco rubbed gentle circles on the back of Daniel's hand with his thumb, a move so familiar it had become their version of a lullaby. They didn't talk much. They didn't need to. The pilot declared the air smooth and the world below glittered with rivers you could trace with a fingertip if you were a child, with a map spread in your lap and a future. Still being decided, Portland greeted them with a briny breath. The rental car smelled faintly of pine. The harbor had that purposeful, unpretentious bustle that reminds you this is not a postcard for everyone else. It's home for the people who know which ropes to coil and when to coil them. Their first inn was a refurbished captain's house with white trim and deep porches. The innkeeper, a woman in her 70s with bright blue glasses, slid a guest book across a counter polished by decades of elbows and stories. "Welcome, friends," she said. And she meant it. "Cream cheese blueberry muffins at 4? Sparkling water in the fridge. If your room feels drafty, it's the house flirting. She's old, but she's good." They lay their bags down like the bags were relieved. Daniel opened the window. The sash protested a little, then yielded with a sigh. A gull declared something surprising to his companions. Marco leaned against the frame and whispered, "We made it." They walked the working waterfront slowly, sharing a paper boat of fries and a cone of ice cream that left a white comma at the corner of Marco's mouth. Daniel dabbed it with a napkin. "Living dangerously," he teased. "Saving room for the muffins," Marco countered, nodding toward a chalkboard sign that announced them like a headline. "Blueberry muffins, 4 p.m. sharp." People gathered on the porch as the hour neared, as if responding to a bell only hearts hear. When the tray appeared, still warm, the porch hummed. The muffins tasted like someone's grandmother had whispered the recipe to the batter, "Be kind today, and don't rush the baking." Dinner that night was early. Habit, preference, and a promise to each other to keep this week gentle. They found a small place with wood tables, windows glowing against the evening, and a server who called everyone dear without making it feel like a performance. Lobster rolls with just enough butter to make a memory, a salad that tasted like the color green. The couple at the next table was celebrating 50 years. The husband's bow tie was slightly askew, but his smile was exactly right. "What's your secret?" Marco asked while they waited for the check. The wife held up her fork. "We share, especially the last bite." Back in their room, Daniel took a small square of stationery from the desk and wrote 3 lines. He didn't say anything about it. He tucked the paper into his wallet behind a photo from years ago. The one where they're younger and somehow already the men they have become. Marco took a shower and sang a Motown classic, missing every high note with cheerful commitment. Morning brought fog that moved like a cat, unhurried, pleased with itself. They poured coffee carefully from a French press and stood barefoot on the cool wood floor, looking at the harbor where boats rocked as if agreeing with each other. They didn't do everything. That was the point. They picked one thing, sometimes 2, and did it with their whole attention. At the Portland Head Light, they found a bench that felt like it had been saving itself for them. A woman sketching the lighthouse glanced over, then back to her paper. Marco said, "You're catching the way the light falls." She looked startled, then grateful, many artists' first reaction to being understood. They walked the paved path slowly. Daniel took a photo of Marco facing the sea, hands in his pockets, wind lifting his hair the way time had. A grandfather explained to his granddaughter why a beacon matters, his voice carrying on the wind. "You can't stop the dark from coming," he said, "but you can decide what you're going to shine." They took that with them. The drive to Camden took them through towns that felt like they'd been built by conversation. White churches with steeples pointing past the clouds, diners with pies cooling in windows, a hardware store where you could probably solve your life if you went in looking for a nail and came out with advice about gutters and kindness. Marco slowed for pedestrians even when they weren't planning to cross, because slowing down felt like the point. Daniel read aloud from a guide he'd printed. Best places to sit and look. He circled 2. Their room in Camden faced a harbor of masts and quiet industry. A ladder of wooden steps led down to a little dock, and they sat with their legs dangling, shoes off, pants rolled like boys for a moment, though the years showed in their hands and the gentleness with which they handled everything. A young man sat a few yards away, head bent over a sketchbook. "Trying to draw the wind," he said half to himself. "You'll get it," Daniel said. "You already see it." They booked a harbor cruise on a wooden schooner captained by a man with smile lines and a hat his wife had stitched with a tiny anchor. The wind did that generous thing where it shows up but doesn't make a show of itself. Marco took off his hat and squinted into the brightness. Daniel put the hat back on his head. "You'll thank me later," he said. And Marco would, because later the mirror would show a kind of burnt forehead, if not for the intervention. The captain told stories of foghorns and winter storms, of the way a town feeds a crew's family when an engine goes down, of a lighthouse keeper who played the fiddle with such devotion the herring fishermen claimed they could hear it through the hull. Everyone leaned in the way people lean towards stories that have done some traveling. Back on land, a light rain began, the kind that encourages bookstores to glow more golden than usual. They ducked into one and found a table of local authors, a shelf of travelogues, and a cat who considered herself management. Marco picked a paperback about a man who walked the length of the state on old roads and new ones, greeting strangers and learning the names of birds. Daniel found a kind letterpress postcard of the very lighthouse they'd seen that morning. "Let's write ourselves a note," Marco said, coaxing the cat from his lap. They sat at a little table by the window and wrote in quiet. "To ourselves. From ourselves, remember the muffin porch. Remember to stop when the light tells you to stop. Remember to drink water and carry a sweater and not to rush the good parts because the good parts are not spearfishing. They don't swim away if you take a breath first." In the afternoon, they drove toward Bar Harbor, the road unspooling like ribbon through spruce and birch. Daniel's left knee complained a little. Marco handed him a bottle of water without looking away from the road. "Break at the next scenic overlook?" "When the sign tells us," Daniel said, because he had become the kind of man who trusted signs that said, "Scenic overlook," and also signs that said, "You might need a moment." They arrived at an inn that had seen a great many summers and had the grace to be honest about its age. The owner wore a sweater that had been darned in the elbow and a welcome like a blanket. "We put chairs everywhere," she said, gesturing to the lawn, the porch, the small landing halfway up the stairs. Stopping is part of the journey. Acadia National Park waited like a cathedral. They chose carriage roads, generous in their width, gentle in their grade, steady underfoot. The old stones of the bridges held their stories with quiet dignity. Cyclists passed, teenagers rode a tandem and discovered patience. A woman in her 80s walked with her daughter, both of them laughing at an inside joke that had been inside for decades. Daniel stopped to watch water fan itself over rocks. Marco stood with his hand resting light on Daniel's back. They didn't say, "This is perfect." They said, "This is enough," which is what perfect often means when you're old enough to understand. They saved Josephine's famous popovers for a day when the line was long but the conversation was good. A couple from Kansas told them about a road trip they took in a car that rattled like a drawer of silverware. A college kid described seeing the ocean for the first time and crying without warning. "It's a lot," he said, apologetic. "It's supposed to be," Daniel assured him. Evenings were for early dinners and slow strolls. Once they sat on a bench and listened to a violinist play Moon River, so gently the song seemed to bow its head and tiptoe. Marco hummed along, eyes closed. Daniel had never been a crier, not easily. But here, watching the hand of the musician, feeling Marco's shoulder press light against his, he let one tear escape and didn't chase it back. He was tired of chasing things that needed their say. There was one small crisis, because vacations that have none don't feel like real life. On the fourth morning, Daniel realized his medication case wasn't where it always was. Calm spilled out of him like sand from a tipped pail. He didn't panic. He's not that man anymore. But he felt the air prickle. "Marco," he said, his voice even. "Okay," Marco answered, already reaching for his phone. They checked the car, the bedside table, the pocket in the backpack they sometimes forget exists. It was nowhere. They had planned for this. Copies of prescriptions, numbers in a neat list, and even so, the moment asked for steadiness. They called the doctor's office back home. An on-call nurse with a Sunday voice handled everything with competence that felt like kindness. By mid-afternoon, a small white bag waited at the pharmacy in town, and Daniel exhaled the kind of breath that makes your chest feel less like a drawer jammed with papers and more like a room freshly aired. "Teamwork," Marco said as they walked back along the sidewalk where hydrangeas nodded like old friends. "Always," Daniel said. That night they ate at a family place with red check tablecloths and a server who proudly announced, "My mother's opened this place when I was 5. The pizza had a blistered edge and basil like little green flags. A family at the next table sang happy birthday off-key and with gusto. Marco clapped for them. Daniel joined, and nobody felt silly because joy needs witnesses. On the 5th morning, They woke very early because sometimes you need to do that just to remember there is a Cadillac mountain in the world and also inside you. And you are allowed to climb both with a little intention. They drove carefully up the winding road with a few other headlights keeping them company. At the top, the world felt wide and very still. The horizon had not yet made up its mind about color. The first edge of light curled itself gently around the dark as though tucking it in. Marco leaned into Daniel. Their breath made small ghosts in the cool air. Daniel took from his pocket the small square of stationery he'd tucked there days ago. "I wrote this on our first night," he said. Calm voice, strong. Marco nodded. "I want to hear it, if you want to read it." Daniel unfolded the paper like something precious. He read about muffins and maps, sure, but mostly about the quiet bravery that lives in kitchens and waiting rooms, about the way Marco's laugh had been a rope he'd held in the worst waters. He read about wanting to stay curious about the man he loved and to keep asking, what does love look like for us today? He read short lines not because he needed to hurry, but because he wanted each sentence to sit. When he finished, the sun had made a decision, and the world was ready for the day. Marco took Daniel's hand, squeezed once. He had nothing written. He wasn't the list maker. He was the singer, the stirrer of risotto. He cleared his throat. "I don't have a paper," he said, "but I have something I've been saying to myself. I'm going to say it to you. I know how to care for 100 patients, and I still learn new ways to care for you. Thank you for letting me. Thank you for asking me to. I will always ask for help with the heavy things, groceries and grief. I will keep a sweater in the car for you. I will say the soft thing even when the room is noisy, and I'm going to keep dancing with you where there's room, even if it's just the square of our kitchen." They stood like that for a long time. A couple nearby wiped their eyes and pretended it was the wind. Someone whispered, "Congratulations," though it wasn't a wedding, not today. It was simply two men deciding again to do what they'd promised. Love as a practice. The day unfolded with that vow in their pocket. They drove to a cove where the sea made lace on the rocks. Daniel held Marco's elbow as they walked across the uneven ground. Marco pointed out a starfish clinging despite the push and pull of the tide. They stopped for lunch at a place locals loved, which is its own kind of compass. The chowder arrived in bowls that could have doubled as bird baths. An older gentleman at the counter told them how his wife used to say, "Chowder tastes best when you've earned the hunger." "We earned it," Marco assured him. The man winked. "You always do. The trick is to notice." They noticed. They noticed the way afternoon light filters through spruce, turning needles into stained glass. They noticed a child offering a sticky fist full of blueberries to her grandfather with the solemnity of a priest. They noticed the way Daniel's shoulders settled when Marco put on the old jazz station in the car. They noticed the small tiredness that comes not from being overwhelmed, but from being very, very present. They took a nap. It was glorious. On their last evening on the coast, the innkeeper suggested the Bass Harbor headlight at dusk. "Don't try the steps if they feel fussy," she advised. "There's a spot on the road where you can see everything without the knees getting chatty." They took her advice. They found the pullout and watched the lighthouse keep its calm vigil. No drama, just the unshowy work of shining when it's needed. Marco slipped his arm around Daniel. Daniel rested his head against Marco's shoulder. "I wished for this," Daniel confessed quietly. "Not the lighthouse exactly. The calm. You made it," Marco said. "We made it." They drove back in that contented, quiet couples earn over years of speaking honestly. They packed slowly, the way people do when they've gathered more than souvenirs. Daniel placed the medication case gently in the front pocket of his bag and patted it like an old friend. Marco tucked the paperback he'd almost finished near the top. He liked to leave a chapter for home, a small bridge between there and here. The drive south felt different, which is how you know a trip did its work. The road remains the road, and you have changed. They stopped at a farm stand, bought a pint of strawberries that tasted like the reason summer was invented, and chatted with a teenager who had just gotten his first car. "It starts every time," he said, wonder in his voice. "Keep oil in it," Daniel advised, sounding exactly like his father used to. Portland offered them a last afternoon like a gift. They sat in a coffee shop where the barista remembered Marco's name from 3 days ago and somehow remembered Daniel likes room for cream. They bought 2 pastries and tore them in halves, and true to the wisdom of the woman in Camden, they saved the last bite to share. They wrote postcards to friends and one to themselves. They dropped them in a blue mailbox on the corner. The sound of the cards slipping into that dark was satisfying. They trusted the small journey of the mail. At the airport, a man in a Red Sox cap asked them where the best lobster roll had been. Marco answered with such authority, you would have thought he'd been conducting a study for years. The man wrote it down on a napkin, thanked them, and then asked softly, how long? When he noticed their rings. 33 together, Daniel said. 8 married. Good on you, the man said. May we all be so lucky and so good. The flight home was uneventful in the very best sense. Clouds, a nap, a gentle landing. Their neighbor had watered the plants, left a note taped to a jar of soup. Welcome home. Warm on low. No need to return the jar. The cat pretended she'd been offended by their absence for about 6 seconds, and then curled up on Marco's lap in a compromise. Home is where routines prove their worth. They unpacked over 2 days, not 2 hours. Daniel taped the little card from their first night, the one he'd read at sunrise, on the fridge with a magnet shaped like a state they both love. Marco set the shells they had not taken, they leave the beach as they found it, next to the bowl of lemons, a reminder that even looking is a way of keeping. They placed the paperback and the guide on the shelf and wrote the date inside, in case they needed to remember. They would not forget, but they wrote it anyway. Dinner that first night home was simple. Grilled cheese with tomato slices, salad with too much pepper because that's how Daniel shakes it. Jazz on low. The windows open to the evening neighborhood noises. Bikes, a screen door, laughter. I want to frame the card, Daniel said, nodding toward the fridge. I was thinking the same thing, Marco replied. Hallway near the family photos. It is family, Daniel said. Those words, they did frame it. And they added a new small habit to their mornings. After breakfast, before the news, one of them would ask, what does love look like for us today? Some days the answer was spaghetti and a walk. Some days it was, I'll make the calls. You take the nap. Some days it was, we'll sit with grief, then water the hydrangeas. A week later, an envelope arrived from Bar Harbor. Inside, a photo printed by the innkeeper. 2 men silhouetted by a peach sky, a lighthouse doing its quiet job, the ocean busy, as always, and faithful. On the back, in a tidy script, she'd written, come back when the leaves give the hills a new sweater. They smiled, placed the photo on the mantel, and circled a weekend in October in pencil. Daniel looked at the pencil, then at Marco, and shook his head, smiling. Get the pen. Pen it is, Marco said, producing an erasable pen from the drawer because some compromises are delightful. They did go back in the fall. The hills had indeed put on their sweaters. They walked a little less and sat a little more, and it was exactly right. They sent a postcard to the Kansas couple care of the inn where they'd met, and received a card back. We're still sharing the last bite. On a Sunday morning, they found a small church with coffee so strong it could stand up and argue, and they stood at the edge of the lawn afterward, sun on their faces, listening to kids playing tag while older folks traded recipes. Nobody asked them to explain themselves or their rings. This, Marco said, is what I mean by home everywhere. At some point, months later, Daniel admitted he'd been afraid the trip would expose how tired he'd been, how fragile. It did, Marco said gently, and then it showed us what helps, which is another way of saying the truth set them free, and also reminded them to pack the sweater. If this were a montage, you would see them moving through a world made gentler by how they pay attention. Daniel cutting 2 sandwiches diagonally because Marco likes the triangles. Marco checking Daniel's pocket for the little case before they leave the house. Daniel fixing a squeaky hinge with the concentration of a man diffusing a tense meeting. Marco learning the names of the kids on their block and remembering which one loves dinosaurs and which one needs a high five after spelling tests. You'd see dance moments, a figure 8 in the kitchen to Al Green on the radio, a sway in the cereal aisle because the store speaker played their song, a spin in a parking lot under a streetlight because the sky looked like a theater willing to lend its stage. You'd see hard moments, too, because life is not a brochure. A waiting room with bad art, a doctor speaking carefully, a day of headaches. You'd see Marco rubbing Daniel's knuckles and telling a joke so bad it loops around to good. You'd see Daniel giving Marco the bigger half of the last piece of toast. You'd see what love looks like when it's working hours no one sees, measuring salt, measuring patience, measuring steps on a day the knee is chatty. You'd see two men who are not finished learning and who treat that fact as luck. Every once in a while, on a Sunday, they pull out the map again. The paper has softened with use, edges feathered, folds starting to fray. They trace roads with fingertips, say, "What about here?" And "We could sit there," adding towns not because they're chasing the next best thing, but because planning is a way to say, "We believe in the future." They keep their list kind, warm socks, hats, water, patience. They add "ask for help" in ink, and when they talk to you, because this is, after all, a video meant to keep you company, they say this: "Don't wait for perfect. If the budget says 1 night away, take it. If the knees say 1 mile, honor them and find the mile that lets you see something beautiful without punishing you for being human. If you're scared, pack it. Fear is heavy, yes, but it behaves better when you give it a seat and a snack. Plan the practical things, medications, snacks, charger cords, and then leave space for what you don't know yet. Bring curiosity. Bring the sweater. Maybe your lighthouse is a diner that's been open since 1954 and serves coffee that tastes like hope. Maybe it's a bench at the edge of a lake where someone once told you good news and the water remembered. Maybe it's your own front porch with a potted fern and a neighbor who waves. Go there, sit, share the last bite of the muffin. Save a sliver for each other. Ask out loud, "What does love look like for us today?" Answer gently. And if the answer surprises you, that's a sign you're listening. Back in their kitchen, Daniel and Marco keep the framed card near the photos. Nieces and nephews, their mothers in younger years, a dog they loved once and still miss the way you miss a small moon that used to orbit you. They have a new routine where once a month they write short notes and tuck them into a bowl. Sometimes the notes say, "Thank you for calling the plumber." Sometimes they say, "I like the way you said good morning today." Sometimes they say nothing words. Popovers, lighthouse, Cadillac, that are just keys. Reminders of doors they can open in their minds when the day is long. Their neighbor, the one with the cat and the soup jars, watched their video from the couch with her knitting. She left a comment. "This made me get out my map." A teenager from 3 blocks over wrote, "I didn't know love could look like this. I want it to." A man in Kansas said, "We share the last bite." A woman who had lost her wife 6 months ago wrote, "Thank you for reminding me to sit by the water and listen." The internet can be a strange place. Sometimes it is a porch with muffins at 4. You might wonder what they brought home that actually fit in a suitcase. A tea towel printed with a lobster, yes. A pamphlet about Acadia's birds. A coaster that now lives under the cold glass Marco nurses through baseball games on the radio. But the real souvenirs are habits. Leave earlier. Loosen the schedule. Find the bench. Share the last bite. And questions. Do we have what we need? Do we have each other? Yes. Yes. On a Tuesday, a few months after the trip, a storm blew through their town and took the power with it. They lit candles and sat at the table with a deck of cards. The house hummed in that different way a house hums when it's just people and breath and rain. "Remember the fog?" Marco said, and Daniel did. The fog in Portland. The way it had made the harbor ring softer, the gulls quieter, the muffins taste like comfort. "We're good at fog," Daniel said. "We learned to wait for the light." The lights came back on. They left a few candles lit anyway because the glow was nice. Daniel got up to close the window and stopped, hand on the frame, listening. "It smells like the ocean," he said, laughing. "Salt in the air," Marco agreed. "Right here." The thing about a romantic vacation, when it's done with care, is that it doesn't end when you turn in your key at the desk and drive away. It threads itself into laundry and grocery lists, into the way you say hello to the mail carrier, into the way you stack bowls, into the way you ask, "Which sweater?" It reminds you gently the way lighthouses do. Be steady for each other. Shine when it's dark. Take turns keeping watch. Pack snacks. Ask for directions. Wave to strangers. Write it down. Read it out loud. Dance in the kitchen if there's room. And make room if there isn't. If you're here with us, if you made it to the end and your tea went cold and you don't mind, then you're in good company. You might be planning a trip now, or you might be planning to sit on your porch and call it a trip because some days, crossing your own threshold with intention is a journey. You might be carrying fear. Give it some air. You might be carrying hope. Give it a chair by the window and a view. Daniel and Marco will pack again, maybe in the spring, maybe in the fall, and they'll double-check the stove together because that's love. They'll send a text to the neighbor. Soup jars ready? They'll take their time through security and laugh at the same jokes, and somewhere above a quilt of clouds, they'll hold hands like it's the first time and the 1,000th because it is. And when the plane tilts and a new coastline comes into view, when the porch has chairs waiting and the muffins are almost ready, they'll feel the same hush. The same hush you feel when the lights go down and the story starts. That quiet that says, here we are. Let's notice. Let's be kind to the day. Let's share the last bite. Let's keep choosing each other.